Season 1 of Boardwalk Empire begins in 1920 at the start of Prohibition. Nucky Thompson, the treasurer of Atlantic City, New Jersey, is the most powerful man on the boardwalk and uses his political connections to profit off of the newly burgeoning bootlegging operations in and around the city. Nucky rose to political power under the tutelage of his now ailing mentor, the Commodore. Aiding Nucky is his younger brother Eli, the sheriff of Atlantic City, who envies Nucky's powerful charisma, his loyal and unassuming German butler Eddie Kessler, and his young driver Jimmy Darmody, who Nucky helped raise and send to Princeton, but then he disappointedly dropped out to serve in World War I. Nucky's main whiskey provider in his bootlegging operation is a man named Mickey Doyle. Jimmy detests the drunken and unprofessional Mickey and secretly rats him out to agents of the Bureau of Prohibition, forcing Nucky to shut down Mickey's bootlegging operation and find a new whiskey supplier. And so Nucky aligns with the black mob boss Chalky White to not only run the bootlegging operation in Mickey's stead, but also help Nucky secure the black vote in the upcoming elections. Mickey's financial backers, the D'Alessio brothers, are furious by this turn of events, and they all conspire on how to take down Nucky and regain control of the bootlegging operation in Atlantic City. Nucky also begins giving speeches for the women's movement, realizing that women would soon have the right to vote and their support would solidify his power. While getting closer to the women of the movement, Nucky meets and falls in love with the married housewife Margaret Schroeder. Nucky lost his wife and young son years prior and sees in Margaret a chance for a new family. And so, upon discovering Margaret's abuse and miscarriage at the hands of her husband Hans, Nucky tasks Eli with killing the man. Nucky then begins personally providing for Margaret and her children. Nucky's mistress Lucy grows jealous of this new arrangement before ultimately being abandoned altogether. But Nucky's burgeoning relationship with Margaret grows strained as he is hesitant to involve her in his more criminal operations. Meanwhile, Jimmy Darmody has higher aspirations in Nucky's operation, but is never given the chance to prove himself. He now has a strained relationship with his wife Angela and young son Tommy, as he is emotionally distant and volatile. While Jimmy was deployed in the war, Angela had begun an affair, which she ended after his return home. Angela wants Jimmy to return to school at Princeton, but he only has eyes for climbing Nucky's corrupt ladder of power. This motivation is further encouraged by his mother Jillian, a young showgirl who has an uncomfortably close and affectionate relationship with her son. Nucky then stages a meeting with New York mob boss Arnold Rothstein and his protege Lucky Luciano, and Chicago mob boss Big Jim Colosimo and his right-hand man Johnny Torrio. Despite agreeing on mutual terms for the trading and selling of alcohol, Rothstein rips off Nucky, creating a rivalry between the pair. Wanting to prove his worth to Nucky, Jimmy devises a plan with Colosimo's driver Al Capone to steal the whiskey back from Rothstein's men. But in the process, they are forced to kill Rothstein's men and flee the scene, drawing the attention of the authorities. Nucky is furious by Jimmy's reckless actions and fires him, and to avoid the investigation from the Bureau of Prohibition, Jimmy abandons his family and heads to Chicago to work alongside his new friend Al. Prohibition agent Nelson Van Alden leads the charge in investigating the robbery and killing of Rothstein's men, knowing it is somehow connected to Nucky Thompson. Nelson is a religious fanatic and prone to obsessive behavior, earning him the contempt of his colleagues and causing him to neglect his wife. While investigating Nucky, Nelson becomes obsessed with Margaret Schroeder. Upon discovering that one of Rothstein's men survived the robbery, Nelson coldly tortures him for information. The man identifies Jimmy as being one of the shooters before succumbing to his injuries. Despite this, Nelson's superiors reprimand him for going too far on too little evidence. Nelson then finds an accomplice of Jimmy who is willing to testify about the heist against Rothstein, giving Nelson the motivation he needs to continue the case. As Margaret continues to feel neglected by Nucky, she tells Nelson about one of Nucky's illegal beer storage sites. This infuriates Nucky, but then leads to him and Margaret officially consummating their relationship, and Margaret and her children moving in with him. After the passage of women's suffrage, Nucky pressures Margaret to rally the female vote toward his favored candidates. In Chicago, Torrio has Colosimo killed to assume control of his empire, with Jimmy and Al working closely under him. Jimmy quickly proves himself to be a dependable soldier of Torrio, but Al is reckless and violent, even threatening a rival mob boss named Charlie Sheridan into giving up some of his territory to Torrio. Sheridan retaliates by attacking Al's brothel and disfiguring Jimmy's new girlfriend, the prostitute Pearl, leading to her death. This causes Jimmy to fall into an opium addiction. Jimmy and Alden slaughter Sheridan and all of his men, earning Jimmy the praise of Torrio. Meanwhile, Rothstein sends Lucky back to Atlantic City to investigate Jimmy's potential connection to the robbery and murder of his men. As Lucky investigates Jillian, the pair grow close and begin a sexual relationship. As Angela starts up her old affair once again, Jillian tries to convince her to start a new life elsewhere, allowing Jillian to raise Jimmy's son Tommy, but Angela refuses. Lucky convinces the spurned Mickey and Alessio brothers to rob one of Nucky's casinos to secure the money needed to start up their own bootlegging operation, which Rothstein would then support. During the robbery, Eli is shot and seriously wounded, and so Nucky reluctantly asks Jimmy to come back home and serve by his side once again, this time earning a cut of Nucky's empire. Upon his return, Jimmy convinces Nucky to also hire Richard Harrow, a physically and emotionally scarred sniper from the war that Jimmy had befriended at a veterans hospital. When Jimmy returns to Atlantic City, he discovers that Angela has restarted her old affair. He forces her to end the relationship and then demands that she conceive a second child. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Al becomes inspired to be more mature and dependable, earning more responsibility from Torrio running one of his secret breweries. In New York, Rothstein orders the Alessios to kill Nucky, while also taking out life insurance policies on them in the likely event that they fail. During the assassination attempt, Nucky's butler Eddie intervenes to save his boss's life, infuriating Rothstein that they have now lost the element of surprise. Jillian helps Jimmy capture Lucky, who reveals that Rothstein is behind the Alessios' plot. As Jimmy prepares to kill Lucky, Nelson and his partner Sebso arrive to arrest him, thanks to witness testimony connecting him to the Rothstein robbery. Nucky helps Jimmy evade a prison sentence by paying off Sebso to murder Nelson's informant and stage it as an escape attempt gone wrong. With no witness tying Jimmy to the robbery, Nelson is reluctantly forced to free him. Fearing for his life now that Nucky is aware of Rothstein's plotting, Mickey turns to Nucky and rats out the Alessios. Jimmy and Chalky stage a fake whiskey deal to lure out the brothers, murdering most of them. Making matters worse for Rothstein is the government's investigation into his involvement in the massive baseball rigging scandal that made him a fortune. As Rothstein contemplates fleeing the country, Lucky convinces him to instead align with his rival Nucky. Nucky uses his political connections to have Rothstein's case dismissed, in exchange for $1 million and the location of the surviving Alessio brothers, whom Jimmy and Richard kill. Elsewhere, Nelson is suspicious of Sebso following the death of his witness, but his superiors reprimand him further for refusing to drop the investigation against Nucky. A desperate Nelson then visits Margaret and pleads for her to save her sinful soul from damnation and turn on her new lover. When Margaret refuses, Nelson gives in to his own sinful desires, getting drunk and hiring a prostitute, Nucky's spurned former mistress Lucy. The deteriorating Nelson then comes across a river baptism service, where he angrily forces Sebso to repent of his sins before drowning him in front of a church congregation. Finally ready to move on, Nelson requests a transfer from Atlantic City, but upon learning that Lucy is now pregnant with his child, he becomes convinced that it's a sign from God to stay. As election day draws closer, the Commodore instructs Nucky to not back Eli in his re-election as sheriff, due to him being tainted by Nucky's own corrupt actions. Nucky finally confirms to Margaret that he had Eli kill her husband Hans, prompting Margaret to flee with her children. Eli is furious that Nucky put them both in danger by acknowledging the murder, and feels betrayed by his brother's lack of political support. Upon learning of Nucky's young son's death years prior, Margaret reconciles with him, realizing that he truly wants a family of his own to love, and that they can make their relationship work if they view each other as equals. In this spirit of reconciliation, Nucky chooses to help Eli get re-elected as sheriff, though Eli is still dissatisfied by his treatment from his brother. As the season comes to a close, Jimmy finally reconnects with his estranged father, the Commodore. Jimmy discovers that he was conceived after Nucky brought his older mentor, a then 13-year-old Jillian, ultimately getting her pregnant. Jimmy is furious over learning that Nucky essentially pimped out his adolescent mother to an old man. In the end, the Commodore invites Jimmy to join the similarly bitter Eli in working together to bring down Nucky Thompson once and for all. I just want to cut in real quick and say how thankful I am that I don't have to travel all the way to Atlantic City or Las Vegas to play all of my favorite casino games. Thanks to this video's sponsor, Golden Nugget Casino Online, I could bring the Vegas experience right into the comfort of my own home. The Golden Nugget Casino app has all of your favorite casino games right on your phone, like slots, blackjack, roulette, and even games with live dealers. And if you sign up for a new account using my promo code RECAP, Golden Nugget will 100% deposit match up to $1,000 in casino bonus funds. as long as you do a minimum $5 deposit. Plus, if you play $5, they'll throw in 250 casino spins on a featured game. I've been playing fun slot games like Red Hot Joker Cash Eruption, and some good old-fashioned classics like hitting the craps tables. So make any moment a golden moment with the Golden Nugget Online Casino app today. And make sure to use my promo code RECAP for a 100% deposit match and casino bonus funds up to $1,000, plus 250 casino spins on a featured game after playing your first $5. If you have a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER now. In Season 2 of Boardwalk Empire, the Commodore, Jimmy, and Eli continue their scheme to bring down Nucky Thompson. They manipulate the KKK into attacking Chalky White and his crew, leading to Chalky urging Nucky to use his political power to exact revenge against the Klan. But Nucky is worried about making enemies of the Klan's own political forces, and so he refuses to act, displeasing both sides. Nucky is then arrested for election fraud, and upon paying his bail to await trial, he discovers that all of his various ward bosses, business partners, and associates have pledged their support to the Commodore. And to help with their new upstart bootlegging operation, the Commodore and his allies align with Mickey Doyle to run their new whiskey distillery. And so, Nucky declares war on the Commodore, Jimmy, Eli, and all of their new accomplices, all the while preparing for a vicious legal battle. Nucky hires a new driver and bodyguard, Owen Sleater, an assassin from the Irish Republican Army, to fight back for control of the bootlegging operation in Atlantic City. Nucky tasks Owen with blowing up Mickey's distillery, while striking a deal with Arnold Rothstein to help him smuggle booze into the city. Amidst the conflict, Nucky attempts to find solace in Margaret, but their relationship grows strained once again. Margaret's estranged family arrives in the States from Ireland, but they refuse reconciliation, devastating her. Margaret's daughter Emily is then diagnosed with polio, which will permanently cripple her, leading Margaret to believe she is being punished for her many sins committed with Nucky. Emotionally suffering, Margaret seeks comfort in Owen, and the two begin a secret affair. Meanwhile, Agent Nelson Van Alden has remained in Atlantic City, where the area's propensity for drinking, drugs, and debauchery have further corrupted his morals. He continues his secret affair with Lucy, who is on the verge of giving birth to his baby, though Nelson has grown increasingly possessive and abusive. When Nelson's wife Rose visits Atlantic City, she discovers the pregnant Lucy giving birth to a daughter, Abigail. Despite Nelson claiming his intentions to raise the child with Rose, she flees the city heartbroken and files for divorce. Lucy then begins demanding money from Nelson to raise the baby, but his newly sinful desires have left him in crippling debt. In his plot for more power, Jimmy heads to New York City and tries to forge an alliance with Rothstein and Lucky. Although Rothstein turns Jimmy down, Lucky and his business partner Meyer Lansky agree to work with him in secret. Realizing going to war with Nucky on the alcohol trade may prove too difficult, Jimmy and Lucky plot to take on the more lucrative and wide-open heroin trade for themselves. When the Commodore has a stroke that renders him unable to speak, Jimmy assumes command of their partnership, angering the jealous Eli. Eli attempts to make amends and defect back to Nucky, telling him about the Commodore's condition, but Nucky bitterly turns away his brother. A furious Eli returns to Jimmy's side, insisting that Nucky must die for them to continue the expansion of their empire. Jimmy is reluctant to kill his former mentor and surrogate father, but his other closest advisors, including Jillian, Richard, and Al, all agree that Nucky must die. And so Jimmy agrees to allow Al to hire a hitman to kill Nucky, though the hit is unsuccessful. After discovering the assassination plot and Al Capone's involvement, Nucky meets with Rothstein and Torrio to plot his next moves. Rothstein urges patience instead of immediate retaliation, and so Nucky deliberately plots his master plan. As part of that plan, Nucky first informs Jimmy and the Commodore of his plans to resign as treasurer and cede control of Atlantic City to them. Next, Nucky urges Chalky to orchestrate all of the African American workers in the city to go on strike, and then seeks the help of Owen to flee to Ireland to amass funds and support for a counterattack. In Ireland, Nucky meets with IRA leader John McGarrigle, offering to trade guns to the IRA in exchange for shipments of Irish whiskey in Atlantic City. McGarrigle refuses, but he is then killed by his associate Bill Nealon, who takes over as the new IRA leader and accepts Nucky's arrangement. Nucky returns home to find that Chalky has effectively rallied the African American workers of Atlantic City to go on strike, frustrating Jimmy and bringing his operation to a halt. Jimmy finds leading a more difficult task than he assumed, as all of his associates' problems are now his, and everyone has a different idea for the best path forward. One such problem is Manny Horvitz, one of Jimmy's many whiskey buyers. When Jimmy fails to deliver alcohol due to the many hiccups caused by Nucky's plotting, Manny begins unwelcomely ingratiating himself within Jimmy's upper ranks, frustrating the young leader. And so Jimmy orders Manny's assassination, but the older crime boss thwarts the attempt on his life. In an act of revenge, he seeks to kill Jimmy, but instead murders Angela. Jimmy is devastated by this act and fails to properly lead his empire. In turn, his partners restructure their leadership. During this restructuring, Mickey is demoted, prompting him to turn to Nelson and rat out the location of one of Jimmy's warehouses in exchange for money. Following Angela's death, Jillian takes in Tommy and cruelly snarks about her son's late wife, leading Jimmy to attack his mother. The Commodore intervenes to save Jillian and leads to Jimmy stabbing him in the struggle. As the Commodore painfully dies, Jillian encourages her son to put the old man out of his misery, leading Jimmy to have an emotional breakdown. Elsewhere, Assistant Attorney General Esther Randolph arrives in Atlantic City, determined to legally bring down Nucky Thompson. Randolph's headstrong ways inspire Nelson to rededicate himself to his original mission. When Randolph convinces Atlantic City Deputy Halloran to testify about Hans Schroeder's death, Eli Thompson is arrested on murder charges. In turn, Eli is pressured into testifying against his brother Nucky to save himself. Knowing Nelson is working with Randolph, Nucky arranges for a witness to testify about Nelson drowning his former partner Sebso. And so, Randolph attempts to arrest Nelson, but he manages to evade arrest and flee the scene, shooting one of his fellow officers in the process. With Nelson in the wind, Randolph tries to convince Margaret to testify against Nucky. Fearing his lover will turn against him, Nucky proposes to Margaret. Inspired by the tenderness Nucky shows toward the ailing Emily, Margaret agrees to marry him, making it impossible for her to be forced to testify against her new husband. Meanwhile, a remorseful Jimmy finally realizes the error of his ways and makes moves to reconcile with Nucky. He works with Richard to capture the Klansmen who attack Chalky's people and deliver them to Chalky for retribution. Chalky accepts this offer of goodwill and calls for the end of the workers' strike. Jimmy then meets with Nucky, apologizing for his actions and insisting that Eli was behind the assassination attempt. To further earn back his goodwill, Nucky tasks Jimmy to help him sabotage the election fraud case by killing or intimidating witnesses testifying against him and instead frame Eli for the crime. Nucky then convinces Eli to plead guilty in order to serve a lesser prison sentence, who in turn lies about his own involvement in the assassination plot. Before the trial sentencing is official, Nucky is granted funds to build roads between Atlantic City and Philadelphia, which would massively increase the value of the land he and his allies own along the route. To avoid having the land seized in the event of being found guilty, he signs it over to his new wife Margaret. Ultimately, Nucky's case is declared a mistrial, and he is officially free of all legal consequences. And that's when the spurned Manny approaches Nucky, wanting to forge a business partnership, but first insists that the duplicitous Jimmy needs to die. As the season comes to a close, Nelson discovers that Lucy has fled Atlantic City. Evading arrest himself, Nelson takes his daughter Abigail and nursemaid Sigrid, and similarly flees the city. And Nucky lures Jimmy into a meeting, though Jimmy already knows the outcome. After spending a final day with his son Tommy, Jimmy accepts his fate and allows Nucky to murder him in cold blood. Nucky then lies to a suspicious Margaret, claiming that Jimmy had re-enlisted in the army and shipped off back to war. In the end, as Nucky celebrates his success and the development of its valuable land, he is unaware that Margaret instead donated the land to her church parish. In Season 3 of Boardwalk Empire, 1 year has passed, and Nucky Thompson is plagued by nightmares of Jimmy Darmody. Amidst this emotional turmoil, many of Nucky's men turn to Owen Sleater for guidance, while Nucky turns to a mistress, Billy Kent, for comfort, straining his new marriage with Margaret. Despite this, Nucky is now back in charge of Atlantic City, with both Mickey and Chalky running whiskey distilleries under his control. New York mobster Gyp Rossetti then arrives in Atlantic City looking to strike a deal with Nucky to buy rum, on behalf of his boss, Joe Masseria. Nucky sees this as a conflict to his alliance with Arnold Rothstein and turns down the deal, infuriating the volatile Gyp. In retaliation, Jip takes over the town of Tabor Heights, located along the route from Atlantic City to New York, completely blocking Nucky's ability to transport alcohol shipments to Rothstein and his other buyers. Meanwhile, Eli Thompson is released from prison and disappointed to discover that in addition to no longer being sheriff, he must now work hard to earn back his brother Nucky's trust, starting with serving as the weaselly Mickey Doyle's new assistant. To avoid Jip's blockades, Nucky instructs his crews to take longer and more dangerous back roads. Mickey refuses to heed Nucky's warnings and orders his men to drive through Tabor Heights, where despite Eli's best efforts, they fall into Jip's trap and are almost completely slaughtered. Eli informs Nucky of Mickey's failings, earning back his brother's trust and being placed as equal leader of Mickey's distillery. The impatient Rothstein then steps up to help Nucky, tasking the hitman Bugsy Siegel to kill Jip and stop the blockade. Unfortunately, Bugsy fails and Jip flees, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. Jip retreats back to his home in New York, where he discovers that while his men occupied Tabor Heights, rival gangs had encroached into his territories. This infuriates his boss, Joe Masseria, who considers killing Jip for his recklessness, but ultimately spares his life upon Jip's promise to kill all of Masseria's biggest rivals, Nucky Thompson, Arnold Rothstein, and Lucky Luciano. While dealing with the threat of Jip and Masseria, Nucky must also contend with more political enemies. U.S. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon is leading a charge to look into political corruption in the Department of Justice. One of Nucky's associates within the department, Attorney General Harry Doherty, fears for his own career and realizes that to avoid implication, he would need to turn on Nucky and secure a high-profile bootlegging arrest. Esther Randolph, professionally embarrassed after failing to convict Nucky on election fraud charges, agrees to help him bring down the corrupt Doherty, saving Nucky from prosecution and earning herself a much-needed career win. Nucky gains a further political ally by agreeing to secretly operate Andrew Mellon's distillery. Elsewhere, Jillian Darmody now runs a brothel, the Artemis Club, and is raising Tommy, refusing to accept Jimmy's death and choosing to believe Nucky's lie that he has simply gone to war. Richard Harrow remains loyal to Jillian due to his continued devotion to his only true friend Jimmy, and murders Manny Horvitz to avenge the death of Angela. While working for Jillian, Richard grows close to Tommy and begins a relationship with a woman named Julia, giving him hope for a normal life that he thought was impossible. When Lucky pulls out of funding the struggling Artemis Club and Jillian fails at securing a loan, she is forced to consider accepting Jimmy's death to allow the young Tommy to inherit the Commodore's fortune. Jillian then meets a young man that reminds her of her son, insists on calling him James, and then begins a sexual affair with him. She then kills the young man and stages his body to appear to be the real Jimmy, dead from an overdose. With Jimmy Darmody officially declared dead, Jillian is able to secure his inheritance for herself and keep the Artemis Club open, though now is forced to face the reality that Nucky Thompson had truly killed her son. And so, when Jip returns to Atlantic City to enact his assassination plot, he finds an ally in Jillian. She alerts him of a meeting between Nucky, Rothstein, and Lucky at a nearby restaurant, which Jip then blows up. The trio survive the explosion, but Nucky's mistress Billy is killed in the blast. Nucky wants revenge, but the explosion has left him physically and mentally impaired, causing his closest allies like Rothstein and Lucky to refuse backing him in a war against Masseria and Jip. In Chicago, Nelson Van Alden is now hiding out under the name George Mueller alongside his daughter Abigail, his new wife Sigrid, and their newborn son Chester. Nelson now works as a clothing iron salesman but struggles in his new role. When a Prohibition agent arrives at Nelson's home to claim he was sold a faulty iron, Sigrid assumes the agent has discovered Nelson's true identity as a fugitive and attacks him. Nelson is forced to kill the agent and turn to gangster Dean O'Banion to help him dispose of the body. And so, former federal agent Nelson Van Alden is now in the pocket of a gangster O'Banion, putting him in the crosshairs of O'Banion's rival, Al Capone. In New York City, as Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky start up their heroin operation, Rothstein declines to take part, and so they turn to their rival Joe Masseria to forge a new alliance. Having been present at the meeting where Nucky declared his intentions to go to war with and kill Masseria, Lucky warns his new partner to watch his back. Meanwhile, Margaret is inspired to create a women's health clinic, which Nucky is resistant to, putting a further strain on their marriage. This pushes Margaret into restarting her secret affair with Owen, leading to her getting pregnant with his baby. Owen confesses his plans to leave Atlantic City and invites Margaret and her children to join him. Before departing with his lover, Owen follows orders from Nucky to kill Masseria. Unfortunately, thanks to Lucky's warning, Masseria is prepared for the hit and kills Owen. This act devastates Margaret, leading Nucky to finally realize the truth of her own affair. Jip then stages an all-out assault on Atlantic City, seizing control of Nucky's home in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and Jillian's Artemis Club. As Jip grows more violent and erratic, he mercilessly kills the cousin of his right-hand man Tonino after harsh waves destroy some of his alcohol shipments at sea. Trapped in her own club with the young Tommy, Jillian tries to seduce and kill Jip, but he instead injects her with heroin in the hopes of causing an overdose. Outside the club, Nucky finally gathers an army to wage a war against Jip and Masseria, thanks to the help of Chalky, Eli, and Al Capone. Amidst the conflict, Lucky is arrested trying to sell heroin during a sting operation by the police. After securing his release, he and Lansky discover that it was Arnold Rothstein himself who alerted the cops to Lucky's heroin trade, as Rothstein is making moves to secure his own business partnership with Masseria. Rothstein then makes a deal with Nucky, offering to convince Masseria to stop supporting Jip and put an end to the war, in exchange for Nucky giving Rothstein Mellon's distillery. And so, Masseria withdraws his men, leaving Jip almost completely abandoned. Richard leads an assault on the Artemis Club to save Tommy, causing Jip to flee. Nucky then betrays his deal with Rothstein and has his men slaughter Masseria's unsuspecting forces as they withdraw from the city. As a desperate Jip attempts to devise a new plan, he is murdered by his own right-hand man Tonino, who Nucky then tasks to deliver Jip's body to Masseria as a threat to never return to Atlantic City. As the season comes to a close, Andrew Mellon informs Randolph that his still has come under ownership of criminals, and he wants her to arrest those involved, which, thanks to Nucky's maneuvering, now happens to be Arnold Rothstein. After getting an abortion, Margaret is visited by Nucky, who swears he can forget her affair with Owen and only wishes to reconcile. Instead, Margaret refuses, leaving Nucky the winner of a war, but alone in his empire. In Season 4 of Boardwalk Empire, newly minted FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover devises a plan to strike down corruption in the country, which his agent James Tolliver believes starts with finally bringing down Nucky Thompson once and for all. And so, Tolliver is sent undercover to infiltrate Nucky's bootlegging operations. While in Atlantic City, Tolliver secretly tortures Nucky's loyal butler Eddie for incriminating evidence against his boss. But after being reminded of the shame he brought to his family's name back in Germany, Eddie reveals Nucky's connections to the gangster Al Capone before succumbing to his guilt. Meanwhile, Eli Thompson continues to co-manage a whiskey warehouse for Nucky alongside Mickey Doyle. Eli's son Willie wants to join the family's criminal business, but both Eli and Nucky encourage him to stay in school. At school, Willie is bullied by a fellow classmate, but when he tries to retaliate by slipping the bully laxatives, it inadvertently leads to the bully's death. Nucky helps the traumatized Willie avoid prison by framing another classmate, but ultimately Willie drops out of school, to the disappointment of his father. Nucky then puts Willie to work in the office of Atlantic City's Mayor Bader to serve as his eyes and ears. Elsewhere, Chalky White opens up the Onyx Club on the Atlantic City Boardwalk, thanks to support from his silent partner Nucky Thompson. Talent at the Onyx Club is provided by one of Chalky's old associates, Dr. Valentine Narcisse. When Chalky's right-hand man Dunn kills one of Narcisse's men in a disagreement, Narcisse angrily seeks retribution. To ease Narcisse's anger, Nucky offers him 10% stake in the Onyx Club in exchange for peace between all of the partners. Despite this agreement, Narcisse secretly plots for his own rise to ultimate power in Atlantic City. First, he strikes up a partnership with Rothstein and Masseria for heroin distribution in the city. Next, he sends his most prized talent daughter Maitland to perform at the Onyx Club and seduce Chalky. Chalky, though the pair genuinely fall in love. Narcisse then drives a wedge between the partnership of Chalky and Dunn, getting the latter addicted to heroin and inviting him to join his new operation. As Narcisse builds his empire in Atlantic City, he starts to sway the loyalty of its African-American residents to his side over Chalky. Chalky fights back by burning a supply of Narcisse's heroin, and upon discovering Dunn's betrayal, confronts him. As the two men fight, Dunn gets the upper hand, but before he can kill Chalky, Daughter kills Dunn. A furious and vengeful Chalky then launches an all-out war against Narcisse and his men, but is unfortunately overpowered. Nucky tasks Mayor Bader to help smuggle Chalky out of the city for protection, but Willie discovers that Bader is secretly one of Narcisse's many new partners. Before Nucky can intervene, Bader's men attempt to kill Chalky, who manages to kill them all instead. Thinking even Nucky Thompson has betrayed him, Chalky flees the city with Daughter by his side, contemplating his next moves. Meanwhile, Nucky travels to Florida to strike up a partnership with Bill McCoy on a new distillery. Nucky considers bringing Arnold Rothstein into the deal, but after being put off by Rothstein's worsening gambling problem, Nucky instead partners with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. While in Florida, Nucky strikes up a relationship with speakeasy owner Sally Wheat, and as he returns to Atlantic City, he entrusts her to oversee his new bootlegging warehouse. Margaret Schroeder has moved her children to New York City and now works at a Wall Street brokerage firm. There, she is shocked to discover that her boss is in business with Arnold Rothstein, meaning no matter where she goes, she can't seem to escape a life filled with corrupt men. Rothstein falls into a further gambling debt and considers having Mickey Doyle killed to collect money from the insurance policy he took out on him and the D'Alessio brothers years prior. Not wanting one of his top partners dead, Nucky instead buys the policy from Rothstein for pennies on the dollar. Elsewhere, Al Capone rises to further power in Chicago and is impatiently waiting for Torrio to retire so that he can become the new kingpin. While making moves to start influencing local elections, Al brings in his brothers Frank and Ralph to assist in his operations. As former federal agent Nelson Van Alden continues working for rival gangster Dean O'Banion, Al pressures him into serving as his spy. When Al sends Nelson to intimidate voters on election day, a riot breaks out. Nelson takes this opportunity to try and kill Al, but Frank intervenes to save his brother. Unfortunately, the police see Frank with a gun and shoot him dead, devastating Al. Al believes that O'Banion paid the police to kill Frank and is desperate for revenge. When Torrio gives his blessing to have O'Banion killed, Al offers the financially struggling Nelson a bounty to see the job done. Before Nelson can act, other rivals happen to kill O'Banion first. Nelson takes credit for the hit to earn his compensation, then fully accepts his turn from federal agent to gangster under Al Capone's employ. When a group of hitmen try to kill Al, Nelson proves his ultimate loyalty by saving him. Al suspects that his boss Torrio sent the hitmen due to feeling pressure from Al to retire. In response, Al sends his own hitmen to kill Torrio. Though the old boss survives, he realizes he's had enough of his dangerous life of crime and decides to retire in Italy, officially leaving his Chicago empire to Al Capone. After killing all of Gyp Rossetti's men, Richard Harrow has abandoned Julia and Tommy to flee Atlantic City. He shares an emotional reunion with his estranged and pregnant sister Emma, but when past enemies come looking for Richard, Emma is forced to kill them to save her brother's life. Richard realizes he is a danger to Emma and decides to return to Atlantic City. There, he reunites with Julia, who has been granted temporary custody of Tommy Darmody from Jillian. Jillian has fallen on hard times, going broke, turning to prostitution, and falling into drug addiction. Eventually, Jillian meets a wealthy executive named Roy Phillips, who falls in love with her and offers his support in helping her get clean and win back custody of Tommy. To aid in her own fight to win full custody of Tommy, Julia proposes to Richard so they can become a real family. Realizing the custody battle for Tommy could span several years and potentially send the young boy into foster care in the meantime, Jillian emotionally and selflessly stops her fight to allow Tommy to live with Richard and Julia. Jillian seeks comfort in her new lover Roy, who announces that he will soon be leaving Atlantic City, but proposes to Jillian and asks her to come with him. As the pair celebrate, Roy is accosted by a drunken man and impulsively shoots him dead. As Roy emotionally spirals, Jillian comforts him by sharing her own past experiences, including killing a stranger to stage his death as Jimmy's. And that's when Roy reveals himself to be a Pinkerton agent who had gone undercover to gather evidence evidence to arrest Jillian with. As Jillian's trial begins, Richard asks Nucky for the location of Jimmy's body to prove that Jillian had in fact murdered a stranger. Nucky obliges in exchange for Richard's help in a task suited to his particular set of skills. And so Richard sends Julia and Tommy to stay with his sister Emma, promising to return to them after he has successfully taken care of the last of his business in Atlantic City. Meanwhile, Agent Tolliver discovers Willie's involvement in his classmate's death and blackmails Eli to turn on Nucky, or else his son would be sent to prison. As Eli tries to get Nucky and all of his criminal co-conspirators in the same room for an FBI raid, Nucky discovers his brother's betrayal and confronts him at gunpoint. Eli confesses his treachery was only out of love and loyalty for his son Willie. His plan foiled, Tolliver taunts Eli with all of the terrible things that will inevitably happen to Willie in prison, provoking Eli to brutally beat the FBI agent to death. As the season comes to a close, Chalky returns to Atlantic City and confronts Nucky, thinking he has aligned with Narcisse. Nucky swears his allegiance to Chalky, and the pair devise a plan to rid themselves of their villainous rival once and for all. Chalky confronts Narcisse at the Onyx Club, where he is shocked to discover that his daughter Maybelle is being held at gunpoint. Thankfully, Nucky has installed the sharpshooter Richard to take out Narcisse once and for all. Unfortunately, Richard's desire to be a worthy father figure causes him to hesitate in killing Narcisse, and when he finally pulls the trigger, it's Maybelle that he accidentally strikes. A gunfight ensues within the club, resulting in both Chalky and Narcisse fleeing, and Richard being shot and mortally wounded. In the end, Narcisse is apprehended by the FBI, but Hoover cuts a deal with him to help bring down a political leader named Marcus Garvey, abandoning the late Tolliver's plan to take down Nucky. Chalky is forced to flee Atlantic City once again, mourning his daughter, and having completely lost the trust of his family and his community. Nucky remains loyal to his brother and helps Eli flee the FBI for the murder of Agent Tolliver, sending him to Chicago, where he is met by Al Capone's new henchman, Nelson Van Alden. And then there's Richard Harrow, who succumbs to his wounds and dies peacefully in a fantasy of a reunion with his family and a life without scars, both physical and emotional. In Season 5 of Boardwalk Empire, 7 years have passed and the country has been devastated by the Great Depression. With the end of Prohibition on the horizon, Nucky Thompson is now living peacefully in Cuba with Sally Wheat, plotting his business future after alcohol becomes legal once again. Unfortunately, every politician Nucky tries to align himself with is hesitant of going into business with a known criminal. After running into Meyer Lansky and having an assassin try to murder him on the same day, Nucky suspects that Lansky is behind the failed hit and returns home to investigate. Years prior, Arnold Rothstein was murdered due to money owed in his spiraling gambling addiction. The crime boss's death has left a power vacuum in New York City, and Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky are angling to fill it. Lucky works with rival Italian crime boss Salvatore Maranzano to have Joe Masseria killed, then plots with Lansky to take out both Maranzano and Nucky Thompson, which would give them full control of their own criminal empire that extends across the East Coast. To further this plot, Lucky and his hitman pal Bugsy Siegel pay a visit to Valentine Narcisse. Now that Narcisse's business partners Rothstein and Masseria are dead, Lucky threatens Narcisse to remain loyal to him. When Narcisse refuses, Lucky and Bugsy kill his henchmen and many of the prostitutes working at his new brothel to prove their deadly seriousness. Meanwhile, Johnny Torrio realizes he's not content in retirement and decides to join Lucky and Lansky in their plot to usurp control of the East Coast Mafia. He lulls Nucky and Maranzano into a meeting where an assassination attempt is made, though both Nucky and Maranzano survive. Elsewhere, Chalky White now finds himself in a prison chain gang, but eventually manages to escape. He returns to Atlantic City to ask for Nucky's help in finally killing Narcisse, but Nucky insists that the escaped prisoner Chalky should instead lay low. Chalky refuses to heed this warning and instead leaves to kill Narcisse by himself. And that's when he finds daughter Maitland, who has given birth to their child Althea, though they are both caught in Narcisse's control. Chalky then strikes a reluctant deal with his rival Narcisse, earning daughter and Althea's freedom, but accepting his own fate and being gunned down by Narcisse's men in the process. In New York City, Margaret's boss dies, forcing her to hide evidence of his corrupt insider trading with the late Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein's widow Carolyn takes this opportunity to blackmail Margaret for money, or else expose her part in the financial crimes. With no one else to turn turn to, Margaret seeks the help of her estranged husband, Nucky Thompson, who pays off Carolyn Rothstein. Nucky and Margaret then share a tender moment, realizing that though their marriage failed, there is still love between them. Back in Cuba, Nucky has left Sally in charge of his business operations, but she is unfortunately killed during a dispute with the patrolling military forces. While mourning the loss of Sally, Nucky tasks his now equal partner in crime, Margaret, with helping manipulate stocks to make a fortune, setting up a brighter future for themselves, finally free from their life of crime. After being convicted of murder, Jillian Darmody is now living in a women's sanitarium. In the intervening years, she has gotten clean from her heroin addiction, but now must prove her sanity to be released from her sentence. Unfortunately, the sanitarium's Dr. Henry Cotton believes he must perform an unproven and unethical surgery on Jillian to cure her supposed mental condition. With no one else to turn to, Jillian writes a letter to Nucky in a desperate attempt to be rescued from an assuredly grisly fate. Al Capone has spent the last several years running the criminal underworld of Chicago, but his cocaine addiction and a worsening syphilis condition have begun to affect his mind, turning him more paranoid and erratic. Eli Thompson, forced into an exile away from his family, has fallen into alcoholism while remaining a loyal henchman for the Capone crime family. He works under Nelson Van Alden, who has now fully solidified himself as one of Al's most trusted men. Unbeknownst to Al or his inner circle, undercover agent Mike D'Angelo has infiltrated the Capone crime family to gather evidence on the only charges the government thinks they can successfully convict the kingpin on: tax evasion. D'Angelo apprehends Eli and Nelson and blackmails them into helping him steal Al's business ledgers. Unfortunately, Al catches Nelson and Eli in the act and attempts to kill them for their betrayal. As Nelson gets the upper hand to kill Al, D'Angelo intervenes, murdering the disgraced Prohibition agent to save Al's life, with the intent of using the newly obtained ledgers to bring the gangster to proper legal justice. Publicly, Al Capone confidently boasts that he will evade all charges brought against him, but as he leaves to face his trial, Al realizes there is nothing he can do to escape his fate and shares what could possibly be a final goodbye with his son. In Atlantic City, Nucky Thompson prepares for one final battle against Lucky Luciano. Against all odds, the weaselly Mickey Doyle has become one of Nucky's most trusted allies. Now running the Onyx Club, Mickey helps Nucky assemble an army, which includes a new young henchman named Joe Harper. Eli Thompson is allowed by D'Angelo to evade certain death or arrest in Chicago to return to his family in Atlantic City, where he regains his position by his brother's side. Maranzano encourages patience in the war against Lucky, but Nucky wants quick retribution, kidnapping Lucky's hitman friend Bugsy Siegel to hold as a hostage. In turn, Lucky has Willie Thompson kidnapped, demanding a trade. During the exchange, after securing Bugsy's release, Lucky goes against the terms of his agreement with Nucky. Lucky keeps Willie as his hostage and shoots Mickey Doyle dead, demanding that Nucky kill Maranzano and relinquish control of the city, or else Willie will be killed next. And so Eli kills Maranzano on Nucky's command in order to secure Willie's safe release. With that, Nucky's control of Atlantic City is lost, allowing Lucky Luciano to move in and take control for himself. Alongside his allies, Lucky gathers all of the most powerful crime bosses in the country to form the Commission, a governing body for the American Mafia. And in his first act to assert his strength, Lucky tasks Bugsy to assassinate the uncompromising Valentine Narcisse. In the end, Nucky accepts defeat and encourages his young henchman Joe Harper to find something better to do with his life. As for Nucky, he is content with finally leaving Atlantic City for good. He says goodbye to his brother Eli, leaving him money to help provide for his family, informs Jillian that while he can't help secure her escape from the sanitarium or the clutches of the unethical Dr. Cotton, he has set up a trust fund to take care of her after her release. And finally, Nucky shares a slow dance with Margaret to celebrate their new financial windfall. But just as Nucky is finally about to leave Atlantic City, he discovers that Joe has been arrested. Nucky bails the young man out of jail and offers him money, but Joe angrily refuses, revealing himself to actually be Tommy Darmody. Tommy then gets his long-awaited revenge by shooting Nucky Thompson, the man who murdered his father. As Nucky dies, he dreams of himself as a young boy swimming in the ocean, catching a coin that the Commodore had tossed off the boardwalk, drawing him into a life of crime, leading to his inevitable and inescapable fate.